Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Histories Collective. I'm LaChris Robinson Jordan, historian and genealogist. And I know it's been a minute, but we are back. And we are back with, you guessed it, birthright citizenship. What the Supreme Court is really deciding in January. And my goodness, you guys, we knew this was coming. We knew this was coming. And the scope of this particular case is going to be far reaching. Now, many of you probably know that the Supreme Court has decided to hear oral arguments in January. So we will be waiting in anticipation for that. And I will also say that once those oral arguments are heard, we will probably hear from the Supreme Court by the summer, if not sooner. But I wanted to take time tonight to talk about what it all means. Now, many of you have seen our other videos on birthright citizenship, and I will be including those links in the description so that you can see those previous videos so that you can also have context. I will be repeating some things from those videos here, but not all of it. I want to really focus on the case and really get everyone up to speed as to where we are and to really drive certain points home about what we're about to experience here coming up in the next few months and even years. So, the table of contents, you'll see we're going to talk about why no one challenged birthright citizenship until now. We're going to go into the facts of the case of Barbara versus Trump. We're going to talk about the questions the Supreme Court can't avoid in hearing this case. And we will also talk about what will the Supreme Court decide. We're going to give you guys some scenarios and the consequences of those decisions. So let's dive into it. So, why no one challenged birthright citizenship until now? Because here's the thing, we're going to often hear, well, this is the way it's always been, right? And we've been dealing with birthright citizenship for over 125 years. It is part of the 14th Amendment. If you're born on US soil, you're a US citizen, period. So we've been hearing that time and time again. Now, when you look at the previous videos we've made on birthright citizenship, I do go into detail about the 14th Amendment, which was actually a Reconstruction Amendment, and that is sometimes overlooked by mainstream media. They sometimes will mention that, but then we go off into a whole other tangent about what it means now today. But I just wanted to put that out there and mention that because sometimes we don't always remember the historical context of how the Constitution became what it became. And it took several years for the Constitution to be solidified, actually. So, but that is what we often hear is that for over 125 years, the default has been anyone born on US soil, they are a US citizen. So, but the reason why there's been no Supreme Court case is that you can't sue unless you have been injured by government action. So the first has to be an injury or a case to be brought forth to the Supreme Court. So for a century, no one was being denied birthright citizenship. So therefore, no injury existed to take to the court. But now we also have undocumented parents who are now challenging the interpretation. But they didn't before because they benefited from the interpretation. And so, because of that, we have undocumented parents who have no legal standing to challenge the citizenship laws, and they were unlikely to initiate a lawsuit that might restrict their children's rights, so they never brought a case. But what's interesting about Barbara versus Trump is that the parents, the undocumented parents of the children, really aren't able to still have any legal standing, and so therefore that case is being brought forth by nonprofit organizations. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, also, why the issue never came to the Supreme Court is because Congress never passed a law restricting birthright citizenship. So, if Congress had changed the statute, that could have been challenged. But Congress never touched the birthright rule. So, again, no case could form. However, as you will find out later, Congress will have to deal with it. Yes, they will. So, why the issue never came to the Supreme Court? Well, the only way to force judicial review was through an executive order. That was really the only way. And President Trump made that happen with Executive Order 14160. So he had done what no one had done since 1898. So basically, in that executive order, he denied automatic citizenship to a class of US born infants. So they therefore became the injured party. And now lawsuits could be filed. Federal courts now had a live controversy. And now the Supreme Court can no longer avoid the question. So that's the order of things as to why it never came to the Supreme Court. And that's not the case for all cases. I mean, there are certain cases, majority of the time, you don't need an executive order to push judicial review. In this particular case, you did. So, so this is why the case is here for the first time in American history. Now, let's talk about the facts of the case, Barbara versus Trump. Okay. So, at the core of this, when you read the case, the question is going to come up, who is a citizen? So when you look at the 14th Amendment, the citizenship clause says all persons born are naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So that's going to be very, very important, is to be really looking at who is a citizen. So the central question is going to be, has birthright citizenship been properly interpreted under the 14th Amendment, specifically the meaning of subject to the jurisdiction thereof? And that's a qualifier, you guys, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And that's where a lot of this is going to be debated, because what does that mean? Well, what is jurisdiction? Well, jurisdiction is the legal authority of a court, government, or sovereign power to make decisions, enforce laws, and exercise control over a person, event, or territory. So that's going to really be something that we have to look at very closely, because if you're undocumented, there is no way that a government can have jurisdiction over you because you're not a citizen. So looking at the facts of the case, so of course the trigger was President Trump's executive order, which seeks to restrict automatic citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants. So the scope of the dispute will be whether the Constitution requires lawful parental presence for a child to receive U.S. citizenship at birth. In other words, how do we protect the legacy of the 14th Amendment without distorting its purpose? So it's always going to be boiling down to parental presence and the status of those parents in this particular case. So the case was filed June 27th of this year in the U.S. District Court for New Hampshire, challenging the Executive Order 14160 on birthright citizenship. And the District Court of New Hampshire is probably the most liberal district in the country. So that means that if they had filed like in District 5, which includes Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, it would have definitely gotten some pushback because those are very, very conservative states. So now the lawsuit was brought on behalf of children born in the US to non citizens and non permanent residents after February 20th, 2025. And February 20th was a key date because that was when the executive order went into effect. So that lawsuit was brought on behalf of the children born. Now, what's interesting is that the case name, Barbara, follows this single plaintiff, but she stands in for a much larger class. So you're talking about many children who were born after that time, and now they're in a class that is part of this lawsuit. And so through the babies are the official plaintiffs. Okay, they are the official plaintiffs, and their legal representation comes from 7 organizations, as you can see here, primarily the American Civil Liberties Union, right? And Legal Defense Fund, and the Asian Law Caucus, and the Democracy Defenders Fund. So all of these organizations are representing the babies. Now, how many? So since the executive order went into effect, we are basically talking about, roughly based on national birth and immigration data, a reasonable estimate is about 200 to 300,000 US born children that fall into this class. It's a lot of children, right? So, and if you talk about their parents being undocumented, you're talking roughly a good 500,000 to 1,000,000 people, persons, if you will, who are going to be affected by this law. That's a lot of people. So, but this is the number of the US born children that would be potentially affected by this law. So, questions. Now, this is going to be huge because the Supreme Court has a lot of questions that they have to consider when they hear these oral arguments and then make their determinations about various things. But these are some of I have a few that I know that the Supreme Court's going to have to be thinking about, but they can't avoid these. And one of them is, can a minor possess a citizenship status that contradicts the legal status of the parent? That's going to be huge because when you think about a minor, right? It sounds really straightforward until you realize that a minor cannot legally consent, a minor cannot legally assert their own jurisdiction, and they cannot legally stand independent of their guardian. So at the heart of this case is you're talking about a minor having to be represented by a guardian or by an organization. So it gets really, really muddy here. And so that means the child's jurisdictional status directly derives from the parent status. And so if the parent is under full US jurisdiction or is not under full US jurisdiction, how can the child who depends entirely on the parent automatically be under full jurisdiction? I know that's a mouthful. It's a total mouthful. I get it. But one of the things I say is that if the answer is no to that question, then birthright citizenship cannot apply when the parents are unlawfully present. And so, therefore, the EO or the executive order may be upheld. Now, if the answer is yes to this question, then the court must explain how a minor can be treated as a fully autonomous legal entity, when in every area of law they are not. I'll let that sink in for a minute because when you talk about a minor being a citizen, that minor still needs to have a guardian, still needs to have a parent, someone to legally represent them. That is a really, really important question. Okay. So in the case of Wong Kim Ark, now I want you guys to go look at the other. Again, I'll have links to these videos, but I went into detail about the Wong Kim Ark case. Now, in the case of Wong Kim Ark, who was a Chinese national, he basically the court basically said yes, he is a U.S. citizen, but he's a US citizen because his parents were legally domiciled in the US. Now, at the time of Ark's case, his parents, although they were legally domiciled, they weren't US citizens because at that time there was what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act did not allow for Chinese nationals to be citizens of the United States, but they were allowed to remain in the United States lawfully. So, in the case of Ark's parents, they had permanent status, which meant that they had full jurisdiction. So, when the Supreme Court ruled in 1898 on this case, the children of undocumented immigrants wasn't even an issue because undocumented immigration didn't exist in the same way in 1898. So that legal category wasn't on the table. Now it is. So when you think about the Supreme Court and you think about them considering precedent, this is going to be the case that they look at very, very closely. Now, the other question that the court will have to be asking is, can the Supreme Court affirm an outcome that violates federal law? Now, what I mean by that is, citizenship is governed by the Constitution, federal statutes, immigration law, and established jurisdictional doctrine. So when you're a citizen, you are governed by all of these things here, right? However, if someone is not allowed to be in the United States under immigration law, then they have not submitted to the jurisdiction of the US. They are not legally recognized as part of the political community, and they cannot confer rights that contradict their own legal status. So, in other words, the Supreme Court can't go against the existing immigration law that we have. They just can't do that. I mean, they can try, but it's going to be very difficult to justify upholding the ability for undocumented people to remain here when the immigration law clearly says that they can't. Okay. So the other question is, will the Supreme Court uphold a legal interpretation that breaks the system? Now, what I mean by that is, say the Supreme Court said, yes, undocumented presence can produce automatic citizenship. Well, then unlawful entry then will become a citizenship gateway, right? So people will continue to come to the United States, have babies, and then then you have it. Now, the other point is immigration law will collapse under that constitutional conflict. So you'll constantly have criminality, if you will, occurring because people will be coming here and having babies, right? So, and then Congress would need to rewrite the entire INA, which is basically the Immigration and Naturalization Act. They have to rewrite it to justify the court saying, yes, you can have babies and be undocumented. So, and this would of course trigger millions of new cases, and federal agencies in particular would be in legal contradiction. So the court basically cannot knowingly create a constitutional inconsistency that breaks statutory law. So getting to the meat of this, what will the Supreme Court decide? Well, like I said in my previous video, you have four justices in particular that are originalists. And what that means is that they view the Constitution through original public meaning, and they don't deviate too much from that. And justices like Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Barrett do that. They're the originalists. So out of the nine Supreme Court justices, four of them basically are very rigid on the original meaning of the Constitution. So that's how they've typically moved. So it'll be interesting to see how people move this time. Now, there's also this term called stare decisis, which basically means that the courts are going to maintain precedent. and overturning it is very rare. It's not uncommon. In the case of Brown versus Board of Education and Dobbs versus Jackson, they can and have overturned the decisions of the court. Now, the court has overturned, more than 230 of its own prior decisions, but this is a tiny fraction of the 26,000 plus cases it has decided since 1789. So, if we're to go off of history, we should pretty much say, okay, well, maybe they'll just uphold Wong. Okay, let's go into this a little bit more. Now, here are some likely scenarios, and this is where it's going to get really dicey. And I think once we begin to understand the scope of this, we'll know that we're not going to be out of the hot water here. Now, option A, let's say Supreme Court upholds Trump's his presidential executive order. Now, the court can say jurisdiction excludes children of unlawful presence. So that means birthright citizenship is no longer universal. So that means Congress at this point must deal with the fallout and rewrite the citizenship law. So a constitutional amendment becomes politically inevitable because you can't have an executive order and then the Supreme Court says, yes, we're going to uphold it, and you don't change the law. You have to change the law at this point. Okay. Option B, Supreme Court overturns or strikes down the executive order and they reaffirm Wong Kim Ark and the status quo remains. And then basically the court says, if you want this change, amend the Constitution. So again, we have to define what a citizen is. Option C, and this is kind of the middle ground here, but it's very narrow. Now, the Supreme Court could clarify jurisdiction, but avoid sweeping change. They could limit the executive order without rejecting the idea behind it. But Congress would still need to legislate. And then here's the other issue. They can create an even worse ambiguity that will require another 5 to 10 years of litigation because now you're going to have lawsuits all over the place. You're going to have, again, lawsuits coming from the undocumented parent. You're going to have more because people are going to say, well, that's not fair. And then guess what you're also going to have, which people haven't talked about a lot, is you're going to have the naturalized citizens suing. And they would have every right to sue. And I haven't even gotten into that here in this video because that's a whole nother lane. I wanted to stay focused on the Supreme Court in possible scenarios, but I will be talking about the naturalized citizen but that does need, in my opinion, more of a deeper dive because when we talk about becoming a naturalized citizen, it is a whole process. It's a whole process. And I really do want to compare and contrast that to what happens when an undocumented person lives here in the United States. So it's going to be pretty heady, you guys, and I can't even begin to imagine what will happen either way. Either way you slice it, there's going to be more litigation, and you definitely are going to have, man, you're going to have a lot of changes administratively. You're going to have a lot of changes politically, and Congress is going to have to just go ahead and either amend the Constitution, which is, that's very, very lengthy. You have to have a certain number of votes, and the states have to ratify that. That could take, man, that could take a couple of years to get at least, I think it's 38 states to say, yes, we're cool with this. So it's pretty heady. But I just wanted to give you guys a quick kind of scenario here, update you on this because it's intense. And always, always, I would love your comments. And I love reading the comments, by the way. and to hear your feedback and to hear your thoughts on this and what you think could happen and what might happen, because it's coming in January, you guys. So always check us out at thehiddenhistoriescollective.com, sign up for the newsletter, get to know us a little bit better, and we will be talking to you guys soon. I have another video that I'm working on right now. I was working on it, but I stopped what I was doing once I found out that the Supreme Court was going to actually listen to this case. So, as always, thank you all for your support, for your likes, shares, and comments, and we will continue bringing you the latest on this particular development in this story. So thank you all so much. We'll be talking to you soon.